The auctioneer's voice cracked like dry wood in winter. Next, the Green Sisters. A cold silence fell over the town square, not the respectful kind. It was the silence of vultures circling, of wolves watching from the trees. This was a hunger that had been waiting a long, long time. They stood on a rough wooden platform, shivering. 3 of them. Annabeth, the oldest at 15, stared out with eyes that had seen too much. Her jaw was set so hard it looked like it might shatter. She was trying to hold the world together with nothing but her own will. Beside her, 13-year-old Clara trembled like a leaf, her eyes darting from one hard face to the next. And little Miriam, only 9, clutched Clara's hand so tight her knuckles were bone white. They were orphans. No family left, no home to return to. Their parents were gone, swallowed by the fever and the unforgiving wilderness. Now, the town that was supposed to care for them was selling them off like used tools. "First girl, Annabeth Green," the auctioneer barked, his breath smelling of whiskey and rot. "Strong, good with livestock, can cook and clean. We'll start the bidding at $4. $4, the price of a sack of feed." A low murmur went through the crowd. A man spat tobacco juice into the frozen dirt. Another tipped his hat back, sizing her up. The bidding started slow, a cruel, lazy fire. $4. I'll give 5. 6. The price hung there, suspended in the freezing air. $6 for a human life. Annabeth didn't flinch. She just stared at a point on the horizon nobody else could see. Clara started to cry, silent tears tracking paths through the grime on her cheeks. Then, a new voice cut through the cold. 7. It wasn't loud, it wasn't a shout, but it hit the square like a hammer blow. Heads turned. Everyone looked toward the back of the crowd, where a man had appeared as if from nowhere. He was tall, his shoulders broad under a heavy gray coat. A black scarf was wrapped around the lower half of his face, and his hat was pulled down low, hiding his eyes in shadow. He didn't move. He didn't raise a hand. He just stood there, a ghost against the gray sky. Whispers shot through the crowd like sparks. "That's Brand. Elia Brand." The name was a story in itself. 2 years ago, a fever had taken his wife and his baby son in the same week. Since then, he'd become a phantom. A man who lived on the edge of the world, speaking to no one, wanting nothing. He had no wife to need help in the house. He had no farmhands to feed. He had no reason to be here, bidding on a girl he didn't know. The auctioneer squinted. "You bid 7, Brand?" The man gave a single curt nod. "Sold," the auctioneer said, slamming his gavel down. "For $7 to Elia Brand." Annabeth finally flinched. The iron wall of her composure cracked. Her sister's quiet weeping turned into ragged sobs. 2 deputies started to move forward, ready to tear her away from them, to break the last link in their chain. But the man, Elia Brand, spoke again, and his one word stopped everything dead. "Wait." The auctioneer paused, irritated. "The sale's done, Brand. Move along." "I'm not done," Elia said, and now he was moving. He walked through the parted crowd like a predator, his boots making no sound on the packed earth. He stopped directly in front of the platform, his shadowed eyes finally lifting to meet the auctioneer's. "I'll take all 3. The square erupted. People weren't whispering now, they were shouting. "You can't do that!" "He only bid on 1. Sheriff Dole finally pushed himself off the gallows post he'd been leaning on. "Now hold on, Brand. That's not how this works. You bid on the 1 girl." "I bid $7 for Annabeth," Elia said, his voice as cold and flat as a frozen river. "I'll pay the same for each of the others. $21. The auctioneer scoffed. "You got that kind of money on you?" Elia didn't answer. He just reached into his coat, pulled out a heavy leather pouch, and tossed it onto the platform. It landed with a thick, undeniable clank of heavy coin. It was real. All of it. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. "Count it," Elia ordered. Sheriff Dole stepped closer, his hand resting near his pistol. The suspicion was rolling off him in waves. "What do you want with them, Brand? A man alone with 3 young girls? Folks are going to talk. For the first time, Elia's gaze fell upon the sisters. He looked past the dirt, past the fear, and met Annabeth's eyes. A spark of something passed between them. Not understanding, not yet, but recognition. "Not what you think, Sheriff," Elia said, his voice low and dangerous. He held the sheriff's gaze until the other man, the man with the badge and the gun, looked away first. The transaction was over in minutes. Elia signed the bill of sale with a rough, steady hand. He didn't say a word to the girls. He just gestured for them to follow, and they did. Annabeth took Clara's hand, and Clara took Miriam's. They followed him to his wagon like 3 little ghosts, not looking back at the town that had sold them. They didn't ask where they were going. They didn't ask what would happen to them. For now, anywhere was better than here. For now, this strange, silent man was the closest thing they had to a rescuer. But as the wagon rolled out of town and into the desolate, frost-choked wilderness, a new kind of fear began to creep in. Because they weren't just leaving a town. They were entering the world of Elia Brand, a world no one had been allowed to see for 2 long years. And they had no idea what they would find there. The ride was long and silent. The wagon wheels groaned over the frozen ruts in the road, a lonely sound in the vast, empty landscape. The trees were skeletal, their branches clawing at a sky the color of old iron. Elia didn't speak a word. He just drove, his shoulders set, his face hidden by the scarf and the shadow of his hat. In the back of the wagon, the sisters huddled together under a single coarse wool blanket he'd tossed to them without looking back. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Who was this man? What did he truly want? Finally, Clara, the brave one, the one who always asked the questions Annabeth was too proud to voice, leaned forward. Her voice was a tiny thing, almost lost in the wind. "Sir, are we going to be your servants?" Elia's answer was immediate, shot back over his shoulder without a turn of his head. "No." Annabeth's eyes narrowed. "If not servants, then what?" "Are you taking us to work on your farm?" "You'll work," he said. "But you'll live, too." The words hung in the air, cryptic and unsettling. Annabeth pushed herself up, her fear making her bold. "You promised you wouldn't separate us." It wasn't a question. It was a demand, a reminder of the one thread of hope she had. "I won't," he said. She stared at the back of his head, willing him to turn, to explain. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice tight. "You don't know us. You don't know anything about us. Why would you buy all 3? For the first time, Elia glanced back. His eyes, just visible in the sliver between his hat and scarf, were dark and deep, like old wells. They held a sorrow so profound it seemed to suck the air from Annabeth's lungs. "Because someone should have," he said. And then he turned back to the horses, and the silence descended again, heavier than before. They rode for what felt like an eternity. The world grew wilder, the road thinning to a barely there track. Finally, just as the sun began to bleed away behind the jagged peaks of the ridge, they arrived. His cabin was small, tucked into a grove of pine trees by a frozen creek. It was little more than a box, 2 rooms with a low roof and a stone chimney that was already breathing a thin curl of smoke into the evening air. It wasn't a mansion, but the porch was swept clean, and the windows weren't broken. It was a place of order in the middle of chaos. He didn't offer them a tour. He just unlocked the door, pushed it open, and said, "You'll sleep inside. The stove's already warm." They hesitated on the threshold, 3 small figures silhouetted against the dying light. They stepped inside like they were entering a bear's den. Annabeth's hands were clenched into fists at her sides, still expecting a trick, a trap. This couldn't be real. Kindness wasn't real. The inside was one main room. It was sparse but clean. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth with a low fire burning. In the corner was a single bed, neatly made. He moved around the room with a quiet efficiency, pouring water into a kettle, chopping vegetables into a pot. He moved like a man who was used to being alone. "I only have the one bed," he said, his back to them. "You three can take it. I'll sleep on the floor by the fire." Annabeth's breath caught in her throat. She had to ask. The question felt like broken glass in her mouth. You're not going to lock the door?" He finally turned to look at them. His expression was impossible to read. "I will," he said, from the inside. Something in the room shifted. It wasn't trust. It was too soon for trust. It was a weary, fragile confusion. A flicker of hope so terrifying it felt more dangerous than despair. When the stew was ready, he ladled it into 3 bowls and set them on the table. They ate slowly, their eyes never leaving him. It was the first hot meal they'd had in weeks. It tasted like a dream they were afraid to wake up from. When night fell, he did as he'd promised. He laid a blanket on the floor near the hearth, checked the lock on the door, and lay down with his back to them. The girls climbed into the bed together, a tangle of arms and legs and nervous breathing. In the dark, Clara whispered, "Do you think we're safe, Annabeth?" Annabeth stared at the rough wooden ceiling, listening to the crackle of the fire and the low, steady sound of the man's breathing. She thought of the auction block, of the leering faces, of the cold that went bone deep. She thought of his strange, sad eyes. "I don't know," she whispered back. But as she drifted into an exhausted sleep, she saw him from the corner of her eye. He was staring into the fire, and she saw him blink, fast, hiding something. It wasn't grief, it wasn't relief. It was something else, something that looked like a man trying to remember how to feel again. The house was full. The silence was broken. For the first time in 2 years, Elia Brand wasn't alone. But beginnings like this are fragile things. They can be shattered by the slightest tremor. And as the last embers of the fire died down, a new sound carried on the wind, the sound of hoofbeats in the snow. A knock was coming, a knock that would test the very foundation of this strange new world. And Elia wasn't ready to answer it. The knock came before the sun. It wasn't the hesitant rap of a lost traveler. It was sharp, deliberate, and official. The sound of law, or what passed for it in these parts. Elia was awake before the second knock fell. The fire was just a bed of glowing coals, casting a faint demonic red light across the room. He rose from the floorboards without a sound, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He glanced at the bed where the 3 girls slept, a single breathing mound under the quilt. He crossed the room and lifted the heavy wooden bar from the door. He cracked it open just an inch. Sheriff Dole stood on the porch, his coat dusted with a fresh layer of snow. His face was grim, his eyes hard. "Didn't figure you for an early riser, Brand." "Didn't figure you for a house call, Sheriff," Elia replied, his voice a low growl. He didn't open the door any wider. "Mind if I step in? It's cold out here." "I do." The sheriff let out a frustrated sigh, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He tried to peer past Elia into the dim cabin. "Just came to ask a few questions. You had your chance yesterday. Not the questions I need to ask now," Dole said, his tone sharpening. He leaned in, his voice dropping. "Those girls, Brand. You know what folks in town are saying, don't you?" "I don't care what they're saying. They think it's strange," the sheriff pressed on. "A man like you, buying all 3, bringing them out here to the middle of nowhere, after everything you lost." The jab was meant to hurt, to throw Elia off balance. It didn't work. Elia remained perfectly still. Dole leaned closer, his voice turning accusatory. "Are you trying to build yourself a new family, Brand? Trying to replace the one you buried?" The cruelty of the question hung in the air. For a long moment, Elia said nothing. Then, he opened the door wider, letting the cold light fall on his face. It was a mask of granite. "That's not your business, Sheriff." "Maybe not," Dole conceded, taking a half step back. "But it becomes my business if someone makes a mistake. It becomes my business if those girls are in harm's way. If I were you, Sheriff, Elia said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with ice. I'd be more worried about who let them get to that auction block in the first place. The shot hit its mark. A flicker of something, guilt, maybe fear, crossed the sheriff's face. He looked away, breaking the stare down. He pulled his gloves on tighter. Just watch yourself, Brand. Keep your nose clean. You should take your own advice, Elia said, and shut the door in the sheriff's face. He stood there in the dark, listening as the hoofbeats faded away into the silence. He had won the first battle, but the war had just been declared. When the sun was finally up, the girls began to stir. Annabeth sat up first, her eyes instantly scanning the room, searching for threats. She saw the look on Elia's face as he stood by the stove. Who was at the door? She asked. The sheriff. Her back went rigid. Is he coming back? Maybe, Elia said, ladling hot porridge into bowls. He set them on the table, his movements deliberate and calm, a stark contrast to the tension in the room. He came to ask questions. What for? Doesn't matter, Elia said, meeting her gaze. You're not going anywhere. The meal was silent, thick with unspoken fears. Annabeth watched Elia, trying to piece him together. Clara barely touched her food. Only little Miriam ate, blissfully unaware of the danger circling their tiny cabin. When they were done, Elia looked at each of them in turn. Tell me about your family. Annabeth's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Mama died last spring. Fever. Papa. He disappeared 2 winters ago. Just walked out into a blizzard and never came back. Some say he ran off. Some say he froze on Calico Ridge. She swallowed hard. Our aunt was supposed to take us. She sold our house and just left. The sheriff found us living in the barn, Clara added quietly. He said the town would take care of us. They did, Annabeth said, her voice bitter. Elia listened, his expression unreadable. He nodded slowly. I won't let that happen again. Later that morning, he hitched the wagon and prepared to leave. He didn't say where he was going. He just took the rifle down from its pegs, checked it, and then set it on the table. He laid out a box of shells beside it. He looked at Annabeth. You know how to use this? She gave a single, sharp nod. Good, he said. Don't open the door for anyone, not even the sheriff. He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. He looked back at them, 3 small, frightened figures in the dim light of the cabin. I knew your father, he said quietly. The air in the room went still. Annabeth's eyes widened. Clara gasped. What did he just say? He was a good man, Elia continued, his voice rough with an old, buried emotion. He wouldn't have wanted this for you. And then he was gone, leaving them locked inside the cabin with a rifle, a box of shells, and a revelation that changed everything. This wasn't random. Their rescuer, their captor, this strange, silent man, he was a part of their past. And that meant he was either their last hope or their greatest danger. They had no way of knowing which. The sound of the wagon faded, leaving an unnerving silence behind. Annabeth immediately barred the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She went to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter, watching until Elia's wagon was completely swallowed by the trees. He knew Papa? Clara whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. Why didn't he tell us? I don't know, Annabeth said, turning from the window. Her mind was racing. If Elia knew their father, what did he know? Did he know why their father had walked out into that blizzard 2 years ago? The story never felt right. Her father wasn't a man who ran from his responsibilities. He was a man who fought. She looked at the rifle Elia had left on the table. It was a heavy, serious weapon. The polished wood and dark steel seemed to absorb the light in the room. This wasn't just a suggestion. It was a warning. He expected trouble. He expected someone to come back for them. Meanwhile, Elia rode into Cold Hollow with a singular purpose. The town felt different now. The stares he got weren't just curious. They were hostile. He was an outsider who had disrupted their cruel little system. He'd taken something they thought was theirs for the picking. He ignored them. He walked straight into Prather's general store, the bell above the door jangling loudly in the tense quiet. Tom Prather, the owner, looked up from his ledger. He was a decent man, but a timid one. "Brand," he nodded, his voice hesitant. "Need supplies?" "Coats," Ilya said, his voice booming in the small space. "3 of them, and boots, and blankets, the warmest you have." He started pulling items from the shelves himself: flour, salt, sugar, dried meat. Enough to last a month. Prather watched him, wringing his hands. "Heard you took in the Green girls, Elia." "You heard right. That's a big undertaking. You planning to keep them?" Elia stopped what he was doing and turned to face the storekeeper. He fixed Prather with a stare so intense the older man had to look away. "I'm not sheltering them, Tom," Elia said, his voice low and firm. Prather blinked, confused. "You're not?" "No," Elia said, slamming a sack of flour onto the counter. "I'm raising them." The few other customers in the store went silent. The words settled over the room like a physical weight. Raising them. It was a declaration. A promise. He wasn't just their keeper, he was claiming them. Back at the cabin, the day dragged on. Annabeth kept watch by the window. Clara tried to read an old, tattered book she found on a shelf. Miriam, sensing the tension, was quiet, drawing pictures in the dust on the floor with her finger. Just as the afternoon light began to fade, Annabeth saw something, a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods. It wasn't Elia's wagon, it was a man on foot. He was just standing there, partially hidden by the trees, watching the cabin. Her blood ran cold. She snatched the rifle from the table. It was heavier than she'd imagined, and the cold metal sent a shiver through her. She didn't know if she could use it, but she knew she had to be ready. She motioned for her sisters to get down, to hide behind the heavy wooden table. The man didn't approach. He just stood there for a long, terrifying minute. Then he stepped forward, nailed something to the fence post at the edge of the clearing, and melted back into the woods. Annabeth waited, her breath held tight in her chest, until she was sure he was gone. She waited until the sun had set and the woods were draped in shadow. Only then did she dare to unbar the door and slip outside. A single piece of folded paper was nailed to the post. Her hands trembled as she pulled it free. The nail was sharp and new. She unfolded the paper. There were only 4 words, written in a crude, angry script. "You don't deserve them." She stared at the note, her heart pounding. This was a threat, a promise of violence. They weren't safe. They had never been safe. She ran back inside just as the sound of Elia's wagon returned. He found her standing in the middle of the room, the note clutched in her hand, the rifle on the table beside her. He took one look at her face, then at the note. He didn't have to ask. He read the words, his jaw tightening until a muscle bunched in his cheek. Without a word, he walked over to the stove, opened the iron door, and tossed the note into the flames. He watched it curl into black ash. That night, as he unpacked the new coats and warm blankets, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. Miriam touched her new coat like it was made of silk. Clara whispered a thank you that was barely audible. Annabeth said nothing. After the girls were in bed, she found Elia sitting by the fire, oiling the rifle. "Tell me about my father," she said, her voice steady. He didn't look up from his work. "We grew up together. We hunted these woods. He was a better man than me, braver." "Why did he leave?" Elia finally stopped, looking into the fire. "He didn't leave, Annabeth. He went looking for something. Something he thought would give you girls a better life. He went prospecting. He told me he'd found a strike, a big one. He was supposed to come back. But he didn't." "No," Elia said quietly. "He didn't." He paused, his voice dropping even lower. "The man who was watching the cabin today, the threats. This isn't just about you girls being orphans. This is about what your father found." Annabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your father didn't just disappear," Elia said, finally meeting her eyes. I think someone made sure he didn't come back, and now they want what was his. Suddenly the threat wasn't just a faceless anger from the town. It had a name, it had a motive, greed, and it was lurking just outside their door, waiting. The next morning, the danger arrived, and it had a well-dressed, smiling face. He came on a fine-looking horse, wearing a city suit and a polished smile that didn't reach his eyes. He dismounted at the edge of the clearing and approached the cabin as if he owned it. Elia met him on the porch, the rifle held loosely in one hand, down by his side but ready. "Good morning," the man said, his voice smooth as silk. "My name is Walter Bryn. I'm a legal representative from the territorial capital. I'm here to inquire about the welfare of the Green children." Elia said nothing. He just stood there, a granite wall of a man. Bryn's smile tightened a fraction. "You must be Mr. Brand, the man who caused such a stir at the auction." He looked past Elia, trying to get a glimpse inside the cabin. "You don't exactly strike me as the proper guardian type, Mr. Brand. A reclusive widower with a reputation." "They're not up for discussion," Elia said, his voice flat. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong," Bryn said, his tone turning condescending. "You see, according to territorial law, the guardianship of orphaned minors must be approved and overseen by a representative of the state. That's me. Your little transaction at the auction was irregular, not legally binding." He was trying to scare him with words, with the threat of a law that Elia knew was bent and broken in these parts. "I have the power to remove the girls from your custody today," Bryn said smoothly, letting the threat hang in the air. "I could file the paperwork this morning and have them declared wards of the state by nightfall." "You do that," Elia said quietly, taking a half-step forward. The rifle didn't move, but the threat of it suddenly became very real. "And you'll find out that paper doesn't stop a bullet." Bryn's face paled. The slick smile vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine fear. He was a man used to getting his way with threats and legal jargon, not with the cold reality of violence. He took a step back, tipped his hat in a mocking gesture, and retreated to his horse. "This isn't over, Brand," he called out as he rode away. He didn't ride far. Elia saw the smoke from his campfire that night, just beyond the ridge. He was close, watching, waiting. Inside the cabin, Annabeth had been listening at the door. Her face was pale. "They're not going to stop, are they?" "No." "Why are you doing this?" she asked, the question tearing out of her. "Why risk all of this for us?" Elia looked away from the window, his gaze settling on the fire. "Because I made a promise to your father," he said, his voice thick with memory. "The last time I saw him, he told me about the gold strike. He also told me he was worried. He had a partner, a man from the city who'd funded his expedition, a man named Walter Bryn." Annabeth gasped. "Your father was afraid Bryn would try to cheat him," Elia continued. "He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd look out for you girls, that I'd make sure you got what was yours." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a grim certainty. "I think Bryn did more than cheat him, Annabeth. I think he killed him for that gold. And now he wants you, because as your father's only heirs, you're the only thing standing between him and a fortune." The entire world shifted on its axis. This wasn't about charity. It wasn't about pity. This was a war that had started 2 years ago with her father's murder. And Elia Brand wasn't just their rescuer. He was their father's avenger. Annabeth felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years. Fury. Cold. Clear and sharp. She went to the small wooden chest where her mother had kept their few precious belongings. She dug past old ribbons and a worn-out prayer book until her fingers closed around a small, cool object. A silver locket. Her father had given it to her just before he left for the last time. "Keep this safe, Annie," he'd told her. "Don't ever lose it. It's more important than you know." She'd never understood why. It was just a simple locket. She'd never even opened it. Her fingers fumbled with the tiny clasp. It sprang open. Inside, there was no portrait of her mother, no tiny painting. There was just a strange symbol, scratched crudely into the silver. It looked like a crossed pickaxe over a crescent moon. She showed it to Elia. He took one look at it, and his breath hitched. He reached into his own shirt and pulled out a tarnished leather cord. On the end of it was a small hand-carved wooden token. Carved into the wood was the exact same symbol. "It was our mark," Elia whispered, his voice full of awe and grief. "Your father and I, a secret we shared since we were boys. It meant a promise, a blood oath." He looked from the locket to Annabeth, and for the first time, she saw not a stranger, not a protector, but a man bound to them by a sacred vow. "He was leaving you a message, Annabeth," Elia said. "He was telling you who to trust." The quiet peace of the moment was shattered by the sudden sound of hooves. Not one horse, but several. They were coming fast, crashing through the underbrush with no attempt at stealth. Elia moved instantly. "Get down!" he commanded, pushing Annabeth and her sisters behind the heavy table. He grabbed the rifle, his face a grim mask. This time, it wasn't a lawyer with a slick smile. This was something else entirely. The wolves were no longer circling. They were here to attack the den. Elia didn't wait for a knock. He stood to the side of the door, listening as the horses stomped and snorted in the clearing. He heard rough voices, a low laugh. "You sure this is the place?" one man asked, his voice a gravelly drawl. "This is it," came another. "Lawyer said so. A lone widower and 3 little girls. This should be easy." Elia's blood ran cold. Easy. They thought this would be easy. He kicked the door open himself, taking them by surprise. 3 men sat on horseback. They were rough men, hired muscle, with the kind of dead eyes that showed they'd do anything for coin. The leader, a big man with a smug grin, tipped his hat. "Afternoon. We're looking for Mr. Brand." "You found him," Elia said. "State your business and get off my land." The leader, whose name was Bryce, dismounted slowly, theatrically. "Mr. Bryn has an interest in making sure the law is followed. He sent us to check on the girls' welfare." "Their welfare is fine," Elia said, the rifle still held loosely at his side. "We'll be the judge of that," Bryce said, taking a step toward the porch. "We're just going to have a look inside. You're not setting foot in this cabin." Bryce's grin widened. It was a cruel, ugly thing. "And what if we do?" Elia didn't answer with words. He just raised the rifle. The casual way he held it vanished, replaced by a deadly stillness. The barrel leveled directly at Bryce's chest. The click of the hammer being pulled back was the only sound in the clearing. Bryce's smile disappeared. The other 2 men on horseback tensed, their hands moving toward their own guns. "I'd think very carefully about your next move," Elia said, his voice dangerously calm, "because it will be your last." The bluff was called. The air crackled with tension. Bryce stared down the barrel of the rifle, his bravado evaporating in the cold mountain air. He had come here expecting a scared old man. He had found something else entirely. He had found a killer who had been sleeping, and he had just woken him up. He licked his lips, his eyes darting to his men. "We're just here to talk." "The time for talk is over," Elia said. "Look, Brand," Bryce tried again, his voice less steady now. "I get it. A lonely man, lost his family. You find these girls, you think you can build something back, but this ain't the way. They belong with their own kind, not with you." "Get off my land," Elia repeated, his finger tightening on the trigger. Bryce saw the look in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had already lost everything that mattered, a man with nothing left to fear. He slowly raised his hands and backed away. All right. We'll leave." He climbed back onto his horse, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. "But this ain't over, Brand. Bryn gets what he wants. Always." "Then tell Bryn to come himself next time," Elia said, "and tell him to bring a coffin." They rode off, kicking up dirt and shouting curses. Elia watched them go, his body trembling with adrenaline. He knew they'd be back. This was just the opening salvo. He barred the door and turned to find Annabeth standing right behind him, her face pale but her eyes blazing. I've seen men like them before, she whispered. After Papa disappeared, a man started coming around, said he wanted to help. He brought food, he smiled at Mama. Then one night he tried to touch Clara. Annabeth's voice broke. Mama chased him off with a pitchfork. The next morning our well was poisoned. She looked up at Elia, her young face ancient with trauma. They won't just threaten next time, Elia. They'll do something terrible. She took a shaky breath. Next time they come, shoot first. The innocence was gone. The childhood was gone. In its place was a grim, hard-won wisdom. She was no longer just a girl he was protecting. She was a soldier in his war. The next few days were a blur of tense waiting. Elia fortified the cabin, boarding up the back window and reinforcing the doors. He taught Annabeth how to load and fire the rifle, her small hands surprisingly steady. They were preparing for a siege. The next move came not from a man with a gun, but from a man with a piece of paper. Sheriff Dole rode up to the cabin alone, looking like a man on his way to his own execution. He didn't dismount. "Brand," he called out, his voice weary. "Bryn filed a petition. He got 3 respectable townsfolk to sign it, attesting that you're an unfit guardian." Elia stepped onto the porch. "And let me guess who one of those respectable folk was." Dole had the decency to look ashamed. "He has influence, Elia. He knows things. About a lot of people." He was being blackmailed. It was the only explanation. "I had no choice." "There's always a choice, Dole." "He's got a court order from a circuit judge," the sheriff continued, ignoring the accusation. "It gives him the authority to take the girls into his custody. He's coming for them, Elia. Tonight, and I'm sworn to help him." He was giving him a warning, a final, desperate act of a guilty conscience. "Don't fight them, Elia," Dole pleaded. "You can't win against the law." He spurred his horse and rode away before Elia could reply. The law. Elia spat on the ground. This wasn't the law. This was corruption, dressed up in a suit and tie. He turned back to the girls. Their faces were small and terrified in the fading light. "Pack a blanket," he said, his voice urgent. "Just a blanket and whatever food you can carry. We're leaving. Now." "We're running?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "No," Elia said, grabbing the rifle and the box of shells. "We're not running. We're disappearing." He led them out the back of the cabin and into the woods, just as darkness began to fall. He took them to a place he knew from his hunting days, a shallow cave hidden behind a waterfall, high up on the ridge. It was cold and damp, but it was hidden. "You stay here," he told them, his face grim in the moonlight. "Don't make a sound. Don't light a fire. Don't leave, no matter what you hear." Annabeth grabbed his arm. "Where are you going?" "Back to the cabin." "No!" she cried. "You can't fight them all alone." "I'm not going to fight them," he said, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light. "I'm going to lead them on a ghost hunt." He left them huddled in the dark and made his way back down the ridge. He lit every lamp in the cabin, stoked the fire until it was roaring, and set a pot of stew to bubble on the stove. He made the place look warm, lived in, and occupied. Then he slipped out the back door and melted into the shadows of the woods, circling around to a position where he could watch the front of the cabin. He didn't have to wait long. He heard them coming, a posse of them. Bryn was in the lead, flanked by Bryce and his thugs. Sheriff Dole trailed behind them, his head hung in shame. They surrounded the cabin, guns drawn. "Elia Brand," Bryn shouted. "By the authority of the territorial court, I order you to come out and surrender the children." Silence. The only answer was the crackle of the fire from within. "This is your last chance, Brand." Still silence. Bryn nodded to Bryce. Bryce and another man kicked the door in, splintering the wood. They stormed inside, guns raised, ready for a fight. Elia watched from the darkness, his heart pounding. A moment later, Bryce stumbled back out onto the porch, his face a mask of confusion. They're gone." Bryn shoved past him and went inside himself. He came back out, his face contorted with rage. The cabin was empty. The stew was bubbling on the stove. The lamps were lit, but the people were gone. He'd been played, humiliated. "Find them!" Bryn shrieked, his voice echoing through the silent woods. "They can't have gone far. I want those girls. I want him dead." The hunt had begun, but Elia had the home field advantage. He knew every rock, every tree, every shadow in this forest, and he wasn't just hiding, he was hunting too. The night was alive with the sounds of the hunt. Men crashed through the undergrowth, their lanterns cutting useless beams through the oppressive dark. Their shouts echoed off the ridge, frustrated and angry. They were city men, hired thugs completely out of their element. This was Elia's world. From his vantage point in the rocks above, he watched them stumble and curse. He was a ghost, a whisper in the trees. He moved silently, circling them, drawing them further and further away from the cave where the girls were hidden. He threw a rock to his left. They wheeled and fired into the darkness. He let out a low whistle from the right. They scrambled in that direction, tripping over roots and unseen logs. He was playing a deadly game of cat and mouse, and he was the cat. But Walter Bryn was not a fool. He stood back by the smoldering ruin of the cabin, watching his men flail, his rage cooling into a more dangerous, calculated fury. He realized he was being played. He realized Brand was toying with them. "Enough!" he finally bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Spread out! He's trying to lead us away! The girls have to be hidden somewhere close. Search every cave, every crevice. Find them!" Elia's blood ran cold. The game had changed. They were no longer hunting him. They were hunting his family. He had to make a choice, stay hidden and hope they didn't find the cave or go on the offensive. It wasn't a choice at all. He had been a man of peace for too long, a man hiding from the world. That man was gone, burned away in the fires of grief and loss. Tonight, the man his father knew, the man who made a blood oath, was reborn. He had to get the girls out. They couldn't stay on the mountain. Their only hope was to get to the capital, to St. Arbor, and expose Bryn for what he was, a murderer and a thief. He slipped back toward the cave, moving with a speed and silence that defied his years. He found the girls huddled in the dark, trembling at the sounds of the search party getting closer. Annabeth was at the entrance, a large rock in her hands, ready to fight. "We have to go," Elia whispered, his voice urgent. "They're getting too close. We're going to St. Arbor." "We'll never make it," Clara whimpered. "They're everywhere." "They're looking for us on the mountain," Elia said. "They won't expect us to go down, to walk right past them." He looked at Annabeth. "I need you to be brave, braver than you've ever been." She just nodded, her eyes wide but steady in the darkness. He led them out of the cave and began the perilous journey down the backside of the ridge, away from the main search party. It was a treacherous path in the dark, but it was their only chance. They were halfway down when they heard a shout from below. One of Bryn's men, smarter than the rest, had circled the base of the ridge. He stood in a small clearing below them, his lantern held high, its light catching them in its unforgiving beam. "Hey, I found them!" he yelled. "Up here!" They were caught, trapped on the open face of the ridge. The man started scrambling up toward them, his pistol drawn. Elia didn't hesitate. He pushed the girls behind him. "Run!" he commanded. "Get to the creek bed and follow it down. Don't stop for anything." He turned to face the man, raising his rifle. But before he could fire, another figure burst from the trees behind the man. It was Sheriff Dole. "Get out of here, Brand!" Dole shouted, his face a mess of terror and resolve. He'd finally made his choice. "Take the girls and run! I'll hold him off!" Dole drew his own pistol and fired at the thug, providing the cover they needed. Elia didn't waste the opportunity. He grabbed Miriam, threw her over his shoulder, and half-dragged, half-carried the other two girls down the treacherous slope. Gunshots erupted behind them, echoing through the night. He didn't look back. He couldn't. They reached the creek bed and plunged into the icy water, the cold stealing their breath. They ran, stumbled, and crawled their way down the mountain, the sounds of the gunfight fading behind them. They didn't know if Dole was alive or dead. They only knew he had bought them time. They reached the wagon, hidden in a thicket a mile from the cabin, just as the first hints of dawn were breaking. They were soaked, freezing, and exhausted, but they were alive. The journey to St. Arbor was a nightmare. They traveled by night and hid by day, terrified of every rider they saw on the road. Elia pushed them, and himself, relentlessly. He knew Bryn would not give up. He would have men scouring the territory for them. When they finally arrived in the capital, they were a pitiful sight, ragged, dirty, and half-starved. But they had made it. Elia didn't go to the courthouse. He knew Bryn's corruption ran deep. He went to the one place a man like Bryn couldn't control, the press. He walked into the office of the St. Arbor Chronicle and asked to see the editor. The editor, a formidable woman with ink-stained fingers and eyes that missed nothing, looked them over with skepticism. "I don't have time for sob stories, mister," she said. "This isn't a sob story," Elia said, his voice raw with exhaustion and fury. "This is a story about a town that auctions its children. It's about a corrupt lawyer named Walter Bryn who murdered my friend for a gold claim. And it's about how he burned down my house and tried to kill me and these 3 girls to cover it up." He reached into his coat and pulled out the one thing he'd saved from the cabin, the one thing he'd gone back for while Dole was holding off the thug, the small iron lockbox. He opened it on her desk. Inside were the letters from the girl's father written in the weeks before his death. They detailed his partnership with Bryn, his growing fears, and the location of the mine. And tucked inside was one last, desperate letter addressed to Elia. "He knows, Elia. Bryn knows about the big strike. He's getting greedy. If anything happens to me, don't let him have it. It's for my girls. The map is in the locket. Protect them. It's my dying wish." And beside the letters was Annabeth's locket, with the secret map scratched inside. It was irrefutable proof. The editor's eyes widened. She stared from the letters to the girls, to the hard, haunted face of the man in front of her. She had just been handed the biggest story of her career. "Tell me everything," she said, pulling a notepad towards her. "From the beginning." The story ran on the front page 2 days later. The headline was explosive: "Murder, Greed, and Orphans for Sale in Cold Hollow." It was a firestorm. The story was picked up by papers across the territory. It exposed the rot in Cold Hollow, the corruption of Bryn, and the complicity of the local officials. The governor, facing a massive public outcry, was forced to act. He dispatched a team of federal marshals to investigate. The truth, when it finally came out, was even uglier than the article had suggested. Bryn had hired a man to kill the girl's father in the wilderness and make it look like an accident. He had systematically blackmailed and bribed his way to power, with Sheriff Dole as his unwilling pawn. They even found Dole's body at the base of the ridge. He'd taken the thug with him, but he'd paid the ultimate price for his final act of redemption. Bryn was arrested while trying to flee the territory. He was tried, and for the first time in his life, his money and influence couldn't save him. He was sentenced to hang. In the end, the girls were declared the sole legal heirs to their father's claim. It was, as he had promised, one of the richest strikes in the territory. They were no longer penniless orphans. They were heiresses, but they didn't want the money for themselves. They returned to Cold Hollow not as victims, but as benefactors. They used their newfound wealth to build a proper school, a clinic, and a home for other children who had been left behind by the world. They rebuilt their cabin, bigger and stronger this time, on the ashes of the old one. Elia formally adopted them. The paperwork was just a formality. They were already his. He had been a man hollowed out by grief, a ghost haunting his own life. But in fighting for them, in fulfilling his promise to his old friend, he had found his own redemption. He had found a reason to live again. One evening, as the sun set over the rebuilt cabin, Annabeth stood with him on the porch, looking out at the valley. "He would have been proud of you, Papa," she said, using the word for the first time. Elia put his arm around her, his heart full. He looked at the home they had built, at Clara reading on the steps, and Miriam chasing fireflies in the yard. They weren't a replacement for the family he had lost. They were a new one, forged in fire and blood and an unbreakable bond of loyalty. The world was still a hard place, but they had found their sanctuary. They had faced the wolves at their door and won. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, and a new future, bright and full of promise, stretched out before them. If you were moved by Elia's fight for his new family, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button for more stories of justice against all odds.